I'll be honest, as a Christian, I take issue with critical race theory. But if CRT isn't the right framework for understanding race and racism in America, then what is?
Critical race theory is actually really just wanting us to look at race and racialization and what it means to have lived in a culture that spent 400 years literally making race a big deal. And then all of a sudden in the 1960s passed a few laws and said, okay, we're good now. We can stop talking about race. Let's just act like that never happened.
In part 2 of our series, author Ed Uszynski discusses how to keep our criticism of critical race theory from blinding us to modern-day racism altogether. Ed Uszynski, welcome to Maybe God.
Good to be here, Eric.
Thanks for making the time, brother. I'm looking forward to this.
No, I've loved having these conversations with people that are interested in having them.
All right, me too. I've done a deep dive into you in the last few days, so I feel like I know a lot more about you than our listeners and viewers do. Just catch everybody up on who you are, a little bit about where you come from and what you're doing these days.
Okay, well, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, so I'll at least let people know what part of the country I'm from. For the last 32 years, I've worked primarily with a sports ministry called Athletes in Action. So I worked with college and professional athletes for the majority of my vocational life. As some people will know, I went and did a PhD, which was 11, 12 years ago now that I finished it. And in doing that PhD, I did a deep dive into critical theory and critical race theory, which is what brought about me wanting to write a book about critical race theory once it started to become popularly flying around the internet and news channels. I'm married. I've been married for 25 years, and I got 4 kids here, and I live in Dayton, Ohio now.
Awesome.
So I'm still in the Midwest.
Yeah.
Slugging it out in the Midwest.
My wife and I just celebrated our 25th anniversary, so I guess we share that in common. I've got the book you mentioned here, Untangling Critical Race Theory by Dr. Ed Uszynski. We will get into that in just a moment. Talk about your background in childhood in terms of race and racism especially. You mentioned in the book being raised in a pretty diverse context growing up. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I've really grown to appreciate it through the years because I assumed that everybody had this same upbringing, and that's not true. But where I lived, about 20 miles west of Cleveland, there was an intersection of just a whole bunch of different ethnicities. It was predominantly black folks, white folks, and Puerto Rican folks. Okay, but we had high schools that were mixed along those lines, and so I spent my whole high school years. I was a basketball player, so that obviously had me on the hanging out more with black kids. But I lived in a white neighborhood, and we all wound up going and playing ball a lot in Puerto Rican neighborhoods. And so again, there was always this constant mix going on. And it's interesting, I've thought a ton about it, Eric, through the years. Just what exactly was the racial climate? Because I think I remember that we all got along really well. This was back in the 1980s, and I felt like we got along well with each other. And yet, right beneath the surface, race and racism were always like right there, ready to kind of jump out at us at any moment. I can remember there being lots of fights that took place around race. There were separations in the lunchroom based on race, the more that I've thought about it. So it's like we tolerated each other, and we were in each other's space, and we got along, but it was always soaked in kerosene, ready for a match to be.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you seem to be especially or uniquely able to blend in with a bunch of different groups rather than being only comfortable with people that look like you.
Yeah, for whatever reason, God wired me that way. I've always been intrigued by people, period. And so, yeah, I spent time on all different sides of the tracks. And really tried to understand how different people were thinking on those sides of the tracks, So I found myself even in high school when I was with my white friends who were saying this, that, or the other about the Puerto Rican folks or the black folks, and I remember thinking, yeah, that's not really how they are, or that's not really what they think, or I'd maybe be with all the black guys and hear them talk about the white guys and the Puerto Ricans, right? And it's like, no, that's not exactly how it is. So I was often in this place of being or at least trying to be a translator, between and trying to be somebody that was building bridges before I even knew what that language was, before I was even a Christian, because I didn't become a Christian until I was a freshman at Kent State University.
Interesting.
So even in high school, God was just already wiring me to be the type of person that was at least trying to build bridges.
Yeah. You talk about in the book one really formational moment early in life in high school when you decided who you wanted to invite to the prom. Could you share that story with our listeners and viewers?
Nice, Eric. Wow, nobody's gone after that yet. Yeah, it was actually obviously marked me because I've never forgotten it. I was friends with different groups of people, but I had one particular girlfriend who happened to be black, and her parents really loved me and my family, so I hung out at her house quite a bit. And when it came time to go to prom, even thinking back about this, there was a lot of stress trying to decide, who am I going to go with? Which group am I going to wind up hanging out with? And I really wanted to go with this girl to prom. And so I thought it would be a no-brainer. My parents didn't mind. I was certain that her parents wouldn't mind, but I still wanted to go over and at least pay the respects of asking her mom and dad, for the privilege of being able to take her. And the day that I went over there to ask her, it was very quiet in the room when I walked in, and very somber. And I'm like, man, what's going on in here? And I looked at her dad, and her dad kind of nodded over at mom and said, you need to talk to her. And I just said, can I take your daughter to prom? And she said, no. And she started to cry, and she said, baby, I love you, but you can't take her. And I came to find out that the reason why is because she was concerned about what her black friends would think if their daughter went with a white guy to prom. And some of her church folks is what came out later. And again, I didn't even realize how complicated that idea was when that was happening to me as an 18-year-old. But it's like, okay, I never in a million years would have thought that was going to be their response. But what it taught me was, again, that the race had meaning for people, right? And even if we weren't talking about what those meanings were in front of each other, there were very well built up meaning structures behind the idea of race and skin color and where you're from and who you can be with and who you can't be with. And so, yeah, it made it into the book, didn't it? So obviously it stuck with me. When my sister saw that, she said that was one of the first moments where she realized that racism was something real, that wasn't just something that was inside of white people, but it was something that humans shared, and it will come out in ways when you least expect it.
Yeah. And that was not, I think the reason the story stuck out to me is it's not what I thought you were going to say. So you sort of preface that part of the book by saying, I'm going to share a story about, an early experience I had with racism. I think any reader's mind initially goes to, well, this is a typical situation where, white folks are bad to people of color or something. And this story sort of came out of left field for me and really stuck with me, and clearly has stuck with you. We're all shaped by our experiences, right? And it's interesting hearing you talk about the multi-ethnic neighborhood you grew up in and context, and then this particular situation obviously was heartbreaking and has stuck with you. And you had another experience along, impactful experience along religious lines, and as you mentioned, in your freshman year of college. Talk about how you became a Christian.
Well, I went to Kent State to play basketball. I will tell the short version of this. I wound up actually getting let go from the team in November for a number of different reasons. But the bottom line was I needed to be done with basketball because I was going through really a crisis of just identity, and it was a spiritual crisis. I'm like, what am I doing here? What happens when I die? Is there any meaning to life? I mean, I was like classic existential angst guy. And so I started to meet Jesus people on campus that were explaining the gospel to me. And by February of 1988, so this all happened in November, by February, I just realized that Jesus really was who he said he was. And I was just telling some guys about this the other day. As I read the Bible, I just kept sensing this is true. I don't understand all of it. I sure don't understand all the stuff that goes on in church and all the crazy things that I've experienced and heard other people have experienced. But this Jesus character seems true, and all these words that are in this book are doing something inside me that they had never done before when I'd gone to vacation Bible school or whatever. So it's like the lights just came on. And I immediately started to be discipled again across all different racial lines. I had a white man that was discipling me who was a former athlete who actually worked with Athletes in Action. I had a black man on campus that had a ministry that was geared specifically to black students that I had met in the gym one day, and he invited me to start coming to church with him and start hanging out in their circles. And so again, I was in danger of actually doing too much at the time, but those were the main worlds that I was going back and forth in, this Athletes in Action world that was made up of mostly white folks, and this what was called the ABCs of Salvation world that was made up of mostly black folks. And I was learning about the faith in both of those worlds.
Yeah.
Two very, again, to use the words that we have available, conservative thinking men, orthodox in their view of scripture, very missionally minded. And it was interesting. I write about this in the book. It was the white guy that was actually probably more liberally minded in the way he operated, the way he thought socially. The black guy came from East Cleveland, which is, super democratic and extremely liberal. And yet he was very conservative in the way he spoke and the way he talked, the way he thought socially.
Yeah.
So I just had this wild mix again of the word coming to me through different racial eyes and different backgrounds.
Interesting. Yeah. I think, as I said, we're all shaped by those experiences in our upbringings. And my experience growing up was in some ways similar as far as sports is concerned. Sports is where I really started to understand diversity and how other people come from vastly different settings than I did. But I grew up in a town, man, that was all white people. And that's not an exaggeration. Like Red Lick, Texas was 100% white. And it's not that way as much today. It's like 90-something% white now. But then I didn't go to school with any kids of color. I played basketball in middle school. In that school, I was a star, I think in part because I didn't go to school with any kids of color.
Interesting.
And then I went to high school, which was more diverse, and I found myself less of a standout in the basketball arena. So, yeah. But I still loved to play, and I got to know a lot of kids through that. And interestingly enough, I mean, my family, one half of my family, I would say, is much more racist than the other half. Just culturally speaking. My dad's side of the family, very old school, blue-blooded, like Democrat, and pro-union, and racially more probably enlightened. My mom's side, not so much. When they met my wife, who is a woman of color from Ecuador, my great uncle, I'll never forget, said, "I didn't know you found yourself a Mexican." And it's who he was, right? Nobody really took too much offense to it, but I'm like, Uncle RL, we grew up closer to Mexico than she did. Ecuador is not close to Mexico. But
see, my family was flipped around, actually. So my dad was definitely from the more racist inclination side, and my mom, for whatever reason, just had a more progressive vibe to her.
Yeah.
She was the one that was playing Motown records, and she was the one that I knew wouldn't have a problem if I asked this girl to go to prom.
Yeah.
And my dad was always kind of going along with it. He was tolerating it because I think he knew it was right. But all of his mental framework had been structured in such a way that it was uncomfortable to him.
Sure. Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Well,
so even in the same home, you can be getting very different messages about how to think.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Right. So talk to us about why you decided to write this book. What sort of circumstances led to you being inspired to, a book is hard work, and this is not really a small book. It's significant. And as you said, talking or writing on the subject of race and racism in America is, what did you say, like stepping into a war zone. So that's a choice you consciously made. Why?
Yeah. It's a great question, Eric. So I'll tell you that the biggest reason why is because I had a friend. Her name is Elizabeth Kaprosky, and Elizabeth was dying of cancer. Okay, and Elizabeth has always had she was also on Athletes in Action staff, but she always had a heart for immigrant ministry in the Dayton area. She was always crossing over racial lines and class lines to do ministry. And she was very passionate about it, as are a bunch of my friends. But Elizabeth was just in that close friend circle. And as things were happening in the last 10 years, really the last 15 years, with all the different police shootings and just the different ways that race has been brought to the foreground of our American consciousness, again, kind of going through another race quake, season of race quakes. We were having these conversations all the time amongst ourselves and as we were doing ministry. And I had been speaking very passionately about wishing that my white friends in particular would not be so guided by what was happening in social media and what was maybe being talked about it from different news outlets, but would actually do the hard work of being missions minded Christians. And as she listened to me give these rants all the time, she said, well, when are you going to start writing about this? She said, you've got a PhD, you are able to communicate. And so you do this in our circles, but when are you actually going to put this down so that the church has an opportunity to wrestle with some of the things that you're talking about? And I basically promised her, again, this may not have been the answer that you were expecting, but this really is why I wound up writing it. I basically said, as she was dying, I will do this book, because I've wanted to stay out of it, Eric. Not in the sense that I just want to do the work. Like, my wife is at a HBCU here in Ohio for 20 years. She's been on a predominantly black campus. I just want to keep doing the things that I'm talking about in the book. I don't want to be in arguments all the time with people. I'm not trying to convince people whose feet are dug in and are not interested in changing at all. That's just not where I want to spend my time.
Yeah.
I want to build bridges and I want to help people cross them. So that's why I've stayed out of doing something public. I've stayed out of being a podcaster or a book writer. And she was like, for such a time as this, it might be time for you to actually jump into some deeper water and use your PhD and use your background and use your voice to do more or try to do more.
Sure.
So that's why I'm here. The book just launched a month ago. And so here we are.
Yeah. And I can't stress it enough. You're not here to sell books necessarily, and I'm not here to promote a book, but this book caught me by surprise, Ed, because so much of the dialogue and argumentation being waged around critical race theory is binary. Especially when you see a Christian author writing a book on critical race theory, you sort of these days know what to expect. It's like this is going to be a total evisceration of critical race theory. But you talk in a very different way, a much more nuanced way that I'm sure is opening you up to criticism from both of those sides of that binary. But I just want to lift that up. This is a quote from your book. I think this is in the introduction or first chapter. It says, "We can't go on avoiding or ignoring racism in America. As Christians, we need to talk about race because it concerns brothers and sisters who experience it as more than just a trending topic dropping into their social feed. They feel it every day of their lives." And in this context, this culture we have now where it's just argumentation around, everything is race or nothing is race and racism. You try to enter in with a different conversation. Talk about why that is the approach you chose.
Yeah, good. Well, maybe this is part B as to why I wrote it, and I appreciate you setting me up this way. I mean, Elizabeth really pushed me over the edge, but what was the edge? For me, one, with this whole critical race theory thing, every time I heard critical race theory talked about on the news or in different commentary, I kept having this inside reaction that said, well, that's not what critical race theory is. Like, first of all, I'm shocked anybody's talking about critical race theory all of a sudden. It's been around for 40 years. And, I like I said, I had studied it a decade, 15 years ago in my PhD program as a discipline, a law discipline, right? And an academic lens through which to view the world, which we can come back to that in a second. But the way I kept getting it talked about, like, that's not really what it is. And, again, I don't know whether this has been talked about on your program before, but Christopher Rufo, who is a conservative activist, is really the guy that popularized it through Fox News and by bringing up those three letters, CRT, critical race theory, over and over again. He very deliberately said, we're going to use this critical race theory idea to annex every progressive idea that Americans don't like. And when he says Americans, he means conservative Americans. Everything that we don't like, we're just going to put under the umbrella of CRT. And he was super effective at doing that. Okay. And so usually when I hear CRT mentioned, it's not actually reflecting what real CRT is. And so, Neil Shenby, I know Neil's been a guest. He's done a very good job, I think, of showing that there's something called critical social justice, and there's sort of this critical progressive movement that's taking place. It's really a political movement. And that's a whole nother discussion then that involves sexuality and gender, and it involves, DEI and all these other components of trying to bring a progressive worldview to bear on America. But critical race theory is actually really just wanting us to look at race and racialization and what it means to have lived in a culture that spent 400 years literally making race a big deal. And then all of a sudden in the 1960s passed a few laws and said, okay, we're good now. We can stop talking about race. We're not going to make a big deal about it. In fact, it's illegal to put signs up that say that blacks can't eat here or whites only and these sorts of things. It's illegal now, so we're good. Let's just act like that never happened. And these theorists said, well, that's just ridiculous. There are tons of consequences to having lived this way for 400 years. It doesn't just evaporate. And if we really just look in our field, which is law, there are still laws in place that actually make it so that inequality is almost inevitable. And that's the work that they were doing. They were looking at how power works through law to maintain inequalities between people, and especially looking through the lens of race, which is actually super fascinating stuff. So most of the time when people are upset about CRT, that's not what they're responding to. You know what I mean, Eric? It's like people aren't reading law documents or trying to understand how local laws even work in their community, which is still a fascinating thing to dig into.
Yeah.
It's something else. So I wanted to clear some of that up. I wanted to slowly look at the different theoretical lenses that CRT, the original critical race theorists, were asking us to look through and see, what do we see and what does it mean for the church?
Yeah.
What would the church's response be if we look through those lenses in a nonpartisan way and asked ourselves hard questions?
Right. Yeah, and just to be clear for anybody watching and listening right now, Ed, you are not a proponent of critical theory or critical race theory. You are not saying that it's the right way. You're not defending it really in any fundamental way. You are trying to get Christians to understand that there is something worth understanding about CRT and critical theory writ large, but there's in particular something worth listening to. There's a heartbeat underneath the noise of CRT and our cultural conversation that Christians and churches better listen to, lest the church and the kingdom of God pay some price for it. And I think that's worth saying. We'll get in a moment. In a moment, we'll get into what problems you see in CRT and critical theory. But first, let's sort of talk more about the underlying merits of it. You said that critical race theorists, in your book, you wrote, their work showed how racism could be present without racists, which set off sort of, not alarm bells, but just reminders of other phrases like structural racism or systemic racism. Is that what you're referring to there?
Yeah, and again, I don't understand why people lose their minds over. I guess I do. I understand why that's offensive on the surface. But again, if you slow down and you just, if we ask ourselves, what are patterns maybe that have been put in place that make it such that even though we say everyone is equal, everyone has a shot based on merit to get this job, even though we say that, because of patterns, policies, or just ways of being, you only have white people who are in these leadership roles. You only have white head coaches in the NFL until recently, for example. Or at a local Christian school, I've actually got a number of Christian schools in mind, so I know people are always trying to figure out exactly which one I'm thinking of, but there's literally 4 that I have in mind that I've been associated with, whose racial history was such that they purposely were founded in an effort to be separated from black folks, okay? That's how they started 50 years ago or 40 years ago. And unless they made changes in the way they operate, it's it's likely that they still have only white people that are operating and running the school, even though they're located in places where there's lots of non-white folks. So is it possible, and I'm saying yes, that there's patterns, policies, and ways of being, ways of where you go to hire people, what schools you go to hire people, when you do a search to fill a leadership position, if all you've ever done is gone to a handful of only white schools or schools that are predominated by white folks, it's very likely you're going to wind up with a white person in that leadership role.
I think it's valid, and I mean, I'm not gonna go too hard on this, but I think it's worth also saying that a lot of the conversations being had to this end in the world do seem to want to make culprits of white people on a more individual basis, or at least that's how it comes across. And it's ironic that a worldview that says it's not how something is said, it's how it's perceived or received, that it really matters, right? How the recipient.
Yeah.
And then you have white people going, this doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like we're saying there's this overarching structure that's the problem. It feels like you're saying white people are the problem in the words you choose and the way it comes across. And so I do think there are real reasons. I don't think Christians or white people are just being whiny or something. I think it goes deeper than that. And I think oftentimes we feel like we're being held accountable for the sins of people we never met.
Yeah, me too, Eric. And again, I get it. I sat in a PhD program where white people were talked negatively about for 5 years. And yeah, I know those feelings inside myself of wanting to say, well, you can't just condemn all white people for this or that. But I will say this, like this is the discipline that I've tried to embrace instead of immediately getting defensive. Because that is what we tend to do. So when we feel the way you just described, Eric, which I thought was a great description of feeling like I'm being singled out as being singularly evil for being white, I think it's at least worth, or all of us, because we're all white people, I think it's at least worth asking the question, is that true? Or in what ways might that be true? Instead of immediately running to that can't be true. That there's no culpability over here anymore, because that's usually what happens. We're not racist here anymore. We don't have any racial consequence because of choices we've made or the way that we've lived. And I at least want to be open to asking myself, well, I just told you, I grew up in a home where at least half of my parental, unit was very racist. So unless I've done work to sort of cleanse myself of that racism, it's pretty likely that it still lives in me somewhere.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure. But I would just to gently push back, I would say that's not because you're white. It's because one of your parents were racist. And so it's the idea that, is it possibly true that I'm inherently evil and racist because I'm white? That I think is a bridge too far for most people. And I think it should be.
Agree.
But I also think that's where the cultural, secular conversation wants to nudge things.
I agree. It definitely comes off that way. So again, man, don't hear me saying that's not true. It does come off that way, especially when it's done recklessly and in a sloppy way, often by white people.
Sure.
Also, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Robin DiAngelo and others who have kind of made a platform out of doing that kind of work. Yeah. But I would say, so my white skin doesn't make me inherently evil, but my white skin does immediately align me with a history. It aligns me with a group category that has done a bunch of evil in the name of race. So I just personally want to be careful that I don't just kind of dismiss that too easily. And let me just explore that. Let me just explore what that's meant or looked like in my life and see, is there something that I need to repent of? Is there an attitude or something that's latently still living inside of me that I need the Spirit of God to excise out of me? I just don't want to move past that too quickly. Even though I totally agree with what you're saying from a secular perspective, especially as a person who's trying to live by the Spirit, who is living in a culture that has been hyper racialized. It's been hyper racialized. I can't just sort of cling to my own innocence in the midst of that. I mean,
There's
I
more
can.
work to be done, basically.
Yeah, well, yeah. And I won't do that work if I just right away dismiss those things, even though ultimately, like you're saying, I think the extreme ways that they're talked about is wrong. I at least want to explore it.
Yeah,
And I'll say most people that I'm around won't explore it. And I think
sure.
that's a problem. Most Christian people won't explore it. They just dismiss it.
Yeah, sure. And just to be clear about what racialization or racialized mean, you define it as the unavoidable effect of living in a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. And so then you write, within a racialized culture like ours, some may place too much emphasis on race and others not enough. But you encourage your readers, let's not be distracted by the extremes. We need help thinking about the repercussions of living in a racialized culture, not by becoming more woke in the radical progressive sense, but by having our eyes opened in a spirit-filled mind of Christ sense. What's the difference?
Excellent, Eric. Thank you. Well, and first of all, just to give credit where credit is due, that definition of racialization came from Divided by Faith, which was written back in, I think, 2000 or 2001, where Smith and Emerson did this intense sociological study on race within the world of evangelicalism. And their conclusion was yes, there is definitely still separation, and there is a problem. There's a lack of cross-cultural competency that exists mostly in white folks that needs to be addressed. So they were saying that 25 years ago. What is the difference? I think we just talked about what the difference is. If I'm grounded in the Bible and I'm asking the Spirit of God to be the one that's leading me, it should do two things. It should both open me up to hearing people, again, talking about race. This is true in all categories of life, but if we're talking about race, it should open me up to have a humility to explore where it is that I need to grow, or where it is that I've been wrong, where it is that I've been off base. It should also empower me to be able to see when something is just kind of whacked out.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think because there's been a racial problem that then gives you permission then to mistreat me.
Yeah.
I don't think that it gives you, right? So I think the Spirit of God can lead us in both of those directions, both to give me the humility to learn and also give me sort of a worldview that is able to discern when something is coming from a demonic worldview.
Yeah. I really appreciate how throughout the book you are insistent that we shouldn't just give in to the hysteria of the world and the hysteria of, like right, left, everybody's hysterical about this particular topic. And we as Christians have solid footing that should prevent us from falling into that hysteria. And you talk about this sort of, critical theory, critical race theory, worldview, and the Christian worldview. And if these folks over here, the secular critical race theorists, were to respectfully consider the Christian worldview, theirs would fall apart or be really threatened by our worldview. But if Christians in our worldview just seriously or respectfully consider the concerns that gave rise to CRT, our worldview can withstand that without crumbling. And talk a little bit about why that is. What it is about the biblical or Christian worldview that allows us to, in a heartfelt way, consider something like the underpinnings of CRT.
Well, because my feet are planted firmly on the ground. I say anybody who's grounded in the scriptures, it is grounded in another world, right? Like this is not my home. I'm an alien and a stranger here. This is not ultimately my world. I've got a different kingdom in mind that's got a different ethic, that has a different king, that has different expectations for what human relationships should look like, that has different expectations for how power up will actually be used to serve people instead of to serve myself, right? It's the upside down kingdom. And so I've signed up for a completely different way of doing life that I think, and again, Eric, this is the question. Is it true that one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord? I mean, that's the question ultimately that hovers over all of our lives all the time, right?
Yeah.
We have to make a decision about what we think about that. I am saying yes to that. I believe that Jesus is the beginning and the end of everything in history. And so there's a security that comes from being tied into him. Now, again, there's a lot of messy church stuff up underneath that and around that, right? That's the whole point of your podcast even existing, to
Yeah.
talk about all that messiness. But Jesus himself gives me he's an anchor of the soul. He's a secure foundation that gives me the categories to think in, and like I said, helps me know how to relate to God, how to relate to others, and how to relate to myself in a way that reflects true reality. Okay. Wow, I've never said that all quite like that.
That was good.
On the other side, again, and having been with my progressive friends, they got their feet, as G.K. Chesterton said a long time ago, they've got both feet planted firmly in the air.
It's so
They
good.
really don't. They don't even know what they would really. They know that they want. They know that they don't like people being abused. They know that they want to take care of marginalized and watching out for people that are kind of in the lower, or the underclasses, as you think in terms of class. But if they were to get power, used to ask my friends this all the time: what will you do with it? What will you do to make sure that the people that you've replaced don't wind up being the ones that start being oppressed?
Yeah.
And they don't have a way because there's no foundation. There is no anchor. There is no kingdom worldview script being given to them. All they're going to do is become everything that they hated in the first place. And that's why they need Jesus.
As we all do. Yeah.
If Jesus really is the answer that we just talked about, then he's really what you're looking for. And until you find him, this quest to find your version of justice and the quest to help oppressed peoples and whatnot, however noble it may look on the surface, at the end of the day, it's demonic, because whatever spirit does not lift up Jesus as Lord is ultimately coming from a satanic place. Again, that's some deep water right there.
Yeah,
but
bro.
It is, right? It
Yeah.
is. So, yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, it's I mean, it's just so unique how you go about it in the book, because you're a high level academic with all these degrees and PhD and all this stuff, and you're writing to everyday Christians, and you do an amazing job at distilling the roots of critical theory and critical race theory down to an understandable, comprehensible level. But you go all the way back to sort of the progenitor, I guess, of this, which is Karl Marx himself, and Marxian philosophy that emerged even after his life, and others that carried forward the message. But you do that with a more generous perspective than most Christians would. And it's not because you agree necessarily with Marx, although you talk about how his writings opened your eyes to a lot of things. It's that you saw what he and they were responding to, the brokenness, what we call sin, what they just call oppression or power dynamics and things. And you think it's something, you believe strongly, it's something that Christians should know about and pay attention to. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think so. Again, when we say Christians, globally, that means different things. People come from different theological backgrounds. People have had different Bible verses emphasized or not emphasized for them. So the Christianity that I stepped into in the late 1980s was a Christianity that was influenced significantly by the religious right.
Yeah.
It was influenced significantly by Billy Graham and the evangelists, the parachurch starters that focus very much on a individualistic salvation message, right? Where there's sort of this transactional need for me to get my sins paid for, to avoid hell and judgment on the other side of death. But it was very individualistic in the way that it was handed to me. Mega church. Republican politics, right? Like that all came along with it. Well, what that ended up doing was putting me on one side of the Bible and neglecting another side of the Bible that was spending an awful lot of time. It's funny, I was just in Jeremiah this morning. I'm kind of doing this read through the Bible thing with some friends of mine. And in the first few chapters of Jeremiah, you see this rebuke that happens throughout the Old Testament through the prophets, and that is, things will go well for you, Israelites, if you do two things. Do not bow down to other idols. Have no other God before me, okay? Tear down these Asherah poles, these different sites that you built up that you're worshiping at. So that's one that gets talked about all the time. And the second one is make sure you're doing justice with people. Don't be oppressive. Make sure that the marginalized and the people that are vulnerable in your midst are not being taken advantage of and mistreated and oppressed. Again, like Karl Marx is not the one that
Right.
started using that word.
That's right. It's all over the Bible.
And it's not just spiritually oppressed, which is what my ilk has tended to do with any of that justice or oppression language, is that you need to be set free spiritually. Well, of course, that is also true. But I think God is literally talking about the way people are treating each other and making sure that power is not being used to mistreat people, because it's always being used to mistreat people somewhere. So in our context, are we watching out for the people that God is predisposed to have his eyes on? And he's saying, make sure that these people are not being mistreated in some kind of way.
So in other words, not to interrupt, but in other words, we have a vertical relationship and horizontal relationships. And American evangelicalism tends to only focus, or primarily focus, probably only, more than primarily, on the vertical relationship with God at the expense of the horizontal relationship with people. Marxism, on the other hand, which is atheistic by definition, just says it's the horizontal relationships that matter. There is no vertical. In fact, the vertical is just a distraction from what we really need to be about here. It's an opiate, whatever.
Yeah. Great summary, Eric. Yeah, and so we minimize our horizontal. It's not that we don't have any ethic of how we treat one another and operate with one another, but it's minimized. And somehow we conveniently don't usually do deep dives into what justice means, or what does that word justice look like in our community?
Yeah.
In our congregational community, in the local community, the city or town where we live in, are we paying attention to these things with people? And most of the time we're not.
Yeah.
Too often we're not.
Well, Neil Shenvi, who again is we don't have him in debate format with you, but we've got another episode that's going to be in tandem with your conversation here. He says, invariably we will be forced to choose between critical theory and Christianity. And he said, is our fundamental problem sin or is it oppression? And then he said, is our identity primarily defined vertically or horizontally? So he's talking about all these things, and I guess we're sort of already responding to it. But why is he wrong?
Well, I want to be careful about saying whether or not he's wrong. I think the problem with the way Neil sets it up is he sets it up as a binary. At least I read it as a binary, where it's sort of this either or thing. And some people push back on me and they're saying, no, ultimately you have to choose which worldview that you're going to embrace. So you are making a choice. And I would say yes to that. But I think the fundamental problem is sin, and sin manifests itself in oppression. So let's look at both of them. Let's not set them up so that they're opposed to each other, because this is what I see people do. Well, the answer is sin. And so we're not going to talk about oppression at all, is what ends up happening.
Yeah.
That's the unintended consequence, I think, of how Neil sets these things up. Is it identity in Christ, or is it identity derived from race or something else? Well, I don't want to set it up as though I have to make a choice. My identity comes from Christ, and he does give me a racial identity that matters in my time on this earth.
Yeah.
And we've tended to neglect that side of things. Again, when I say we, I'm talking about that group of white people that I tend to spend my time with in Christian fellowship.
Yeah.
Which has not done a ton of work. Those people that haven't done a ton of work in being cross-culturally competent, or just increasing in racial intelligence. I guess that's another way of saying it. Just haven't done a lot of work in that, when we're honest.
Yeah, and just to play devil's advocate a little bit here, for lack of a better term,
Go ahead.
the idea that race is a social construct is fundamental to CRT. I mean, that's one of the tenets of CRT, is that race is socially constructed and
made up, right? That's what it means, that it's something that's made up and has to be built.
Yeah. So then what would be so wrong about being post-racial and colorblind, let's say, and just not talking about it anymore? Like the famous interview with Morgan Freeman where he says, let's just not talk about it anymore.
I don't want a Black History Month. Black history is American history.
How are we going to get rid of racism until...
Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man. And I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. I know you as Mike Wallace. You know me as Morgan Freeman. You want to say, well, I know this white guy named Mike Wallace. You know what I'm saying?
And I've seen other sort of black celebrities and influencers, academics even, say similar things. What's wrong with just moving on?
Yeah, and I read those guys too, and I appreciate. It is interesting that usually the people that are saying that stuff are people that are wildly successful in one way or another, which is interesting that they be the ones that are saying, let's just move beyond it. You know, again, it sounds silly to say that it's wrong to say that. Of course, I would love for that to be a goal. What I always think in my mind when I hear people say that is, it's too late for that. You can't.
Why?
You can't. Well, because we've already set ourselves up across centuries and there are implications to having set ourselves up along racial lines and racialized lines. There's implications to that are still alive and well in our midst today. So if our history had been that, yeah, we didn't create race as a construct. We didn't come here to intentionally oppress a native people that already lived on this land. We didn't come here and build our economy largely on the backs of slave labor. If we hadn't done that, then it would be way more convenient and easier to say, here in America, we really are a melting pot. We don't treat people on the basis of their skin color or things like that. We never have. If we could say that, then it would be a lot easier to say, yeah, we in this part of the world, I know it looks different in other parts of the globe, but on this land, we're post-racial. We never have let race be an issue. But that's not what happened.
Yeah. But I think, you know, as well as I do, there are people on both sides of, or all sides of this that are exploiting the issues for their own gain or attention or whatever. And so the question might be from the other side, isn't the goal then to become that, to get to that place where we can, you know, reasonably say, honestly say we are beyond it now, the problems of racism? And if so, then how will we know when we're there? Will we ever outlive the sins of our past, and how long must those sins be atoned for, and to what extent, you know, and what's the price to be paid now by white people or by conservatives or by America?
Yeah. Okay, how about this?
I know this is somewhat comedic, two white guys solving all the...
no, here you go. I don't know, right? That's like hours, and those are dissertations and classes. Here's what I can say. This is what I've said to myself about those. Those are great questions. They are. I know what I can say inside the church it should look like and can look like when we're not just integrated, but we are appreciative of difference. We don't just get together and focus on what we can agree about, but we actually learn to appreciate the way God has made us different. What's the other word that I was thinking of beyond integrated? It'll come back to me. Because even in the church, it's not just about being the united colors of Benetton and making sure we got black folks up on stage singing the music or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's actually that I have an appreciation for cultural difference, and I'm learning to embrace people's differences. Now, the next question that comes out of that is what happens when you're in a monocultural setting and you're in a congregation that is all white or all black? Because I would say this to black folks too. It's not just on white people, but we're two white guys talking about white people. I would want black folks and people from all different ethnicities to be doing this same kind of work.
Sure.
Where they are having an appreciation for the different cultures that are represented, white folks that are in their church.
Yeah.
I know what that looks like when people are sacrificing up for each other and loving each other, and they're suffering with each other. They're seeing the same things that are going on in culture, and they're bothered by more than just what's happening in their community. They know how to suffer when they see a black death at the hands of a police officer, regardless of how that came about. Right? Again, we right away, everybody's mind just starts racing to defending one side or the other, and it's like, dude, do you just know how to grieve with somebody? Do you know how to see how this moment right here is attached to a longer history for this person and for this family? It is attached to a longer cultural history that you're not guilty for, and maybe no one in your family is guilty for it, but they're still having and living an experience that's attached to something that you've been able to ignore and not pay attention to.
Yeah. And I think the question is, how do we do that without leaving the door cracked open for, being co-opted by defund the police movements or other kinds of political movements that are, in my view, ridiculous? How do we open our hearts without losing ourselves?
Yeah, you lead. You don't let it happen. Man, again, I have these kinds of conversations a lot in my circles, and I get it. Well, if we do this, then it'll open the door. Well, I can say, tell me about defund the police. Even there, explain what you mean by that to me. I've been in plenty of these conversations, and people mean a lot of different things by that. So if you're asking for the police to be penalized in some way until they get X, Y, and Z part of their act together, I think that's actually an interesting conversation. I have these conversations with police friends all the time. Okay. If we're trying to get them to do something different in their training, how are you going to get their attention?
Yeah.
That is a question that we have to ask as a society, not just for Black folks, but something seems to be a little wonky in the militarized way that police are trained to operate in our midst.
Sure.
And
everybody suffers under that.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is not just a Black thing. So, okay, the question is, how do we get their attention? When they're entrenched and they've got power and they are immune from being challenged in these ways, how do you get their attention? That's always actually the question that ends up coming down when you're trying to bring about a change in society and people either aren't listening or they've created a wall around themselves that's impenetrable. You start setting things on fire. You start blowing things up, right? You start maybe going to an opposite extreme to try to get their attention. And I'm not saying that that's right. Again, we're not talking kingdom of God now. We're just talking about living life under the sun, apart from God, largely.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know how all that's supposed to play itself out, but I don't have to be worried about the door getting cracked open. I can say no to things.
I appreciate your perspective, always calling us out of that binary sort of us versus them, right versus left, just talking in kingdom of God terms, because when you said the phrase under the sun, it reminded me of my favorite section of your book, which was when you talked about Ecclesiastes as an exercise in critical thought, which was such a great reminder, because some of my favorite preachers often say things like God creates and Satan imitates. And the idea of critical thought being a secular invention is a falsehood from the Christian perspective, just like the idea of justice being a secular concept before it was a theological one, or other kinds of things we're talking about here. And so talk about Ecclesiastes as an exercise in biblical critical theory.
Well, the reason why I brought the writer of Ecclesiastes up in the book is because he is looking across 12 chapters, really across 11, because I think it changes in the last chapter. He's looking at life under the sun apart from God. He's trying to make sense of what happens between humans and how do you live a good life and how do you make sense of oppression. Oppression gets talked about quite a bit in the book of Ecclesiastes. And the fact that there are people that have power that will sit at the top of the pile, and there are people that don't, that will be trampled by them. And this is vanity, right? He's probably the king, and he's reflecting on how this is the way life works with no God. And somebody said once that Ecclesiastes actually, it doesn't mention God until the conclusion. To fear God is mentioned in the conclusion, probably by an editor. Ecclesiastes asks the questions that the rest of the Bible answers. That is, how do you make sense of life under the sun apart from God? Well, you need God. You have to find God first. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to make sense of it. There's going to be injustices. There's going to be brokenness. There's going to be a mess. Like that's what everything from Genesis 3 on in the Bible taught us, is that things get ugly and evil things happen between people. So you better start. The beginning of wisdom is to find God, submit yourself to Jesus Christ, deal with your own sin problem, right? Some of these just fundamentals of the Christian message, and then live a different kind of life. It's not about them trying to keep a certain list of do's and don'ts or trying to avoid being a certain kind of person. It's about living in the fullness of the already but not yet kingdom being here. What does that look like on my watch, in my home, with my friends, the people that I can influence? That's what I'm asking myself. I can't solve, I don't know how to solve all the political things that are going on in this world that Satan, the spirit of Satan, is still in control of. I don't know that that's supposed to be my task, is to try to fix all that. In fact, I'm quite certain it's not.
Yeah.
But on my watch, you should be able to smell the kingdom by the way I interact with people. You should be able to smell the kingdom by the way that I'm able to sit in between binary options and transcend them to say there's a different way of looking at this. For those who have ears to hear, this would be a different way of looking at this, and resist my own impulse to be pulled to one side or the other of that political binary, which is something I think we're all susceptible to.
Yeah.
We're going to be forced in November to choose between two sides when we go to the ballot box. That's all we're given, are two options, or you could throw in some made up third. So it kind of sets our mind to think we always end up having to be on one side or another in life. And I've been rejecting that in my soul. I mean, I understand, yes, I'm going to have to show up and do something, but ultimately the way I live my life should look different than what either of these sides are offering me.
Yeah. And one thing you are beautifully articulated in the book is that when we're raising new generations of Christians, to think of their life and their faith individually or just vertically, and less so horizontally with their relationships, we're not giving them good theological, biblical language and tools to deal with the problems they're going to face in the world, the real life inequalities and things that go on in the world. And so then we're just basically handing them over to secular language and ideologies, which is why the sort of neo-Marxist critical theories are gaining so much ground with younger generations.
The language is attractive at the very least. At the very least, the language is attractive.
Yeah.
You know, because I don't think young people are wanting to leave the Christian faith. If the Christian faith means an allegiance to Jesus, they're wanting to leave. Their problem is not theological as much as it's anthropological. Their problem is the way the people that they're getting to watch are living out their faith or failing to live out a holistic biblical ethic. Maybe we don't have, this is another thing that I think is hard to admit, because I even keep saying it to myself, even after doing theological degrees. Maybe I don't have enough Bible inside me right now to be able to think rightly in the midst of this chaotic time that we live in. Maybe there was passages even that I knew or visited when I was in my early 20s, and I'm 56 now, and I realize, man, I haven't spent a ton of time in Isaiah. Like, when was the last time I just did a deep dive in trying to understand the spirit of the minor prophets? You know, again, so we assume we've got enough Bible to be able to survive. Maybe we don't. Maybe that's where we need to start. It's not about trying to solve the problems of society and CRT and all this stuff. Maybe I just need to revisit the Bible.
Yeah.
Like in a deep dive kind of way, right? And understand what really is this message from Genesis to Revelation again. What is God doing in human history right now? And what does the coming kingdom look like? Just revisit some of that, because it almost acts like a spiritual chiropractic visit, right? You get adjusted, and it doesn't fix you for good, but at least for the rest of the day, you're in a different place in the way you view things.
Yeah.
I know I need more of that, and I'm guessing it's true for a lot of people.
Yeah, and a lot of people are Bible readers, but we tend to gravitate to the same parts of the Bible over and over again, the parts that we're more familiar with or the parts that we're more comfortable with.
That's what we do.
Yeah, and I think if we were to force ourselves to access parts of the Bible that are less familiar or less comfortable or more arresting, we would find ourselves honestly grappling with some of the same issues, problems, and questions that gave rise to critical race theory.
That's what's interesting, Eric. That's what got my attention, is that these pagans who have no interest in the things of God were actually exposing my own heart to areas that I've either intentionally neglected or avoided, or I just, again, in my training and the people that I hang out with, for whatever reason, we've somehow excused ourselves from having to pay attention to the importance of watching out especially watching out for people that are marginalized.
Yeah.
So again, that's not a blanket condemnation. If the shoes fit, put them on, right? If because I have that's the other thing. I have conversations with people in Los Angeles, for example, who are having a really different experience with race than people who are in Ohio, from people who are in North Carolina. Like, it's different depending on the parts of the country you live in, or you're in Texas, which is really different than New York City.
Yeah. We don't have racism here.
Well, well, and even the politics, though, is different as far as what gets talked about, what's being forced into the schools, and, who's got the power to try to do certain things. It looks different in different parts of the country. So I recognize that.
Yeah.
I want to be a Christian in whatever part of the country I wind up in, and I need to keep separating myself from partisan allegiance and partisan discipleship, of which there is much that goes on, and make sure that I have a holistic kingdom view that influences and informs the way I'm interacting with people and the social issues that are getting brought to my attention.
Yeah. Amen. And for all the negativity and pessimism, I see reason to hope and be optimistic too in the church. I think some of the fastest growing or largest or more impactful churches that I've been to recently shocked me by how ethnically diverse and even age-wise diverse they were, and generationally, I guess, diverse. And I think Gen Z is going to be great for. I'm bullish on Gen Z, let's say, and I think they're going to be great for the church, actually, and for the world. A lot of people.
Why is that? Why is that, Eric? Why do you say that?
Well, I'm raising 2 Gen Zers right now, and it's a little anecdotal in that sense, but I'm also writing a book, starting to write a book about Gen Z and God, and a lot of the research I'm seeing just shows not only superficially they're the most ethnically diverse generation that we've seen, but they are also the first generation to grow up entirely online, for better or for worse. There's a lot of bad that goes along with that, but they're also being exposed to lots of different ideas and worldviews early on in life, and so they're being forced to ask some of the more philosophical questions before most of us had to ask them. And so they're, in a sense, maturing faster than we did. And I don't know, maybe I'm an optimist, blind optimist, but I just see reasons to believe that Gen Z might be really good for the church in particular. And in a lot of ways, actually, that we don't have time to probably mine or get into.
I like that. And, it reminds me, Eric, we can choose to be as pessimistic as we want to be, and we can choose to be as optimistic as we want to be. And we'll find what we want to find. I've really seen that to be true. There's plenty of stories, of churches that still have their heels dug in on all these different issues and are still very blind in the way they operate. And I've got plenty of examples of churches, like you said, that are, I don't want to use the word progressive because that's so loaded, but they've certainly progressed past their history of ignorance when it comes to race and all other social issues, and they're making a difference in their corner of the world in the way kingdom people should.
Sure.
And it's very exciting to be around those people.
It is. And, I don't say I'm optimistic in the sense that there's still not a ton of work to be done. And I kind of want to end our talk there and just, what do you think it would look like for American churches today to more effectively address some of the root causes that gave rise to CRT and its prominence in our culture, or racism, let's say, writ large? What can churches or should churches be doing more of?
I talk about that in the last chapter, which I wish I could just make available to everybody, because I say I'm not bringing this list of wisdom for how to heal it any different than what's already being done in the best places, which is that it starts with a humility. It starts with a willingness to say, okay, again, we're not going to try to figure out how racist we are. We're going to try to figure out what the implications have been of living in a racialized culture. Are there patterns and policies and things that are a part of how we operate? And I guess this is mostly even for a church leadership team to do this. Is there anything in the way we operate that's in the way of all people not only feeling welcomed, but included? That was the word I was looking for earlier.
Yeah. Not
just integrated, but included. Okay? That's a big question that I think is worth asking. And then when we've kind of made a decision that we want to grow when it comes to cross-cultural competency, what are the ways that we do that? We seek out relationship. You seek out relationships intentionally with other churches that are different than you. You read. You do book studies together on a book, maybe like A Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby, which again, I don't understand why he's caught so much heat. He just does an amazing historical overview of sort of the way race has been handled within the evangelical world across centuries. Mm-hmm. It's good to visit that history and just say, okay, yeah, this is not just like recent. We say we know things were bad, but I don't think we all realize just how systematized and built into our legal structure and built into the church racism has been. Mm-hmm. Because when we get a taste of that, it's like, oh, it makes sense that it would not so easily then disappear everywhere at once in the same way.
Yeah.
You know, so you read books, you watch documentaries together, and you discuss them.
I would add just you listen to your brothers and sisters. To me, it goes back to that. And I think it's as simple and fundamental as that. We can call it whatever brand we want to call it, critical, whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's like if you have a brother or sister who's hurting and they tell you they're hurting, and they tell you the people they love and care about and related to are hurting, I mean, you listen if you love them. And I think it's as simple as that. You listen and you take it seriously and you don't get defensive or combative. And even if it does feel like a threat, you just sort of do what Jesus did for us, all of us on the cross, and you just take it, you internalize it, you don't fight back, and that's what love looks like. And I think at the end of the day, it's as simple as that for Christians. And unfortunately, we're allowing ourselves to be tyrannized by the hysteria of both sides, really, depending on where you come from.
Yeah.
And we're not getting anywhere.
I wish we were equipped. I mean, here's a real practical way to be a good listener that I keep saying to myself. Tell me more about that. Mm-hmm. That's the first question I should be asking. And then when they tell me more about that. Like, dig in. That's what empathetic listening looks like, right? Because what do we mean by listening? Some people listen and they've got Thomas Sowell articles lined up, right? They've got a Fox News video they want to send, a Candace Owens video or something. It's like, okay, there's time for that.
Sure.
But we need to do the work of understanding. So listen for the purpose of understanding, which means lots of tell me more about that. And when did you first feel that way? And do you always feel that way? Or is that just an isolated moment here? Or has that been part of your history? When you just will give a few more questions like that, it's amazing what will happen and the bridges that get built and the love that gets experienced instead of getting defensive right away.
Amen.
That's true in our marriages too, isn't it? I mean, we can apply that in lots of different directions. We need to get better at it.
Yeah. Well, you talk about, this is the last time I'll quote your book. I frankly just love your book, and I think it's a needed voice in the whole conversation. Again, if you're watching, the book is called Untangling Critical Race Theory, What Christians Need to Know and Why It Matters. Forward by Crawford Lawrence, by the way. That's when you got my attention, because I love that man. But you're right. Our response to these disagreements can't be more hysteria. We need tools to promote the kind of civil discourse that says, I think I disagree, but help me see and understand your position. That's what you're saying. Just tell me more, and let's keep the conversation going. And the minute we stop talking to each other, things fall apart. So,
dude, thank you for having access to so many quotes from the book. I seriously appreciate that you did a deep dive into it. You did, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. We could talk another couple hours about, especially about the Marxism chapters and those 8 tenets of CRT. And I had an outline of which of those fit into the Christian worldview, which don't, and why. But maybe we'll save that for another time.
Yeah, if you have a schedule lag somewhere, call me back up and I'll jump in there. Because the book, I almost hate that CRT's in the title, because it's almost misleading to people in the sense that it's not just about CRT. The first 5 or 6 chapters are, but the last 10 are really about cultural intelligence and cross-cultural competency and application. People were always asking the question, how could CRT be of use to the church? And I feel like one of the things this book is trying to do is say, here, this is what it would look like. Here are the questions that you will be asking as a result of CRT.
Yep.
And they could be useful to you.
And succinctly put, I think for Christians, it's helpful to look at it like CRT filled a void and a vacuum of cultural awareness created by willful Christian ignorance. So let's seal up that void and eliminate the vacuum with better biblical thought and Christian worldview that is more holistic. And so really grateful for your contribution to this conversation. And again, if you're watching or listening, I hope you'll pick up Ed Uszynski's book. Any final thoughts, Ed?
No, man. Again, I think I already said them, and that's just an appreciation for you and what you're doing on this podcast. If you're treating me like this, I'm sure you're treating others like this. And these are the kind of interactions we need to have.
Well, thank you, brother.
In the church. Yeah, we need to get better at it. So thanks for modeling it.
Thank you. I'm grateful for you. God bless you, man.
Thanks, Eric.
Bye.